Hello once again from Texas. It's a little bit cooler here now than it was over the last week and weekend. It's about 70 degrees. Not quite pool weather, but hopefully this weekend we will get back up into the 80s and I'll be able to enjoy my pool for at least a couple more weekends before fall finally takes hold of us. So last week we wrote about postbellum America, and I'd written about the difficulties that the freed slaves had, and the disparities in wage in the South, especially when compared to the Midwest, when we also compared that to what they had been in 1860. So this week I wanted to talk about an unusual choice, I think. I wanted to talk about Mark Twain. So going into the post-Reconstruction era, political corruption was everywhere. Mark Twain coined the phrase the Gilded Age because the age from 1870 until around 1900, it wasn't golden, it was gilded. It was literally just a crust of shiny over something that was rotten underneath. This is a time when presidents had very little power, due in large part to highly contested elections in which relative majorities were razor thin. Two elections won the Electoral College without a popular majority. We've seen that in our recent history as well. Further undermining those presidencies were Congresses comprised mostly of politicians operating on the principle of political patronage. Bribery was not only legalized, but it was encouraged in many parts of the country. As business leaders spent significant amounts of money ensuring the government could not regulate activities of big business, they more than often got what they wanted. The corruption was so commonplace that in 1968, New York state legislatures legalized such political bribery. Howard Zinn, an American historian, argues that the U.S. government was acting exactly as Karl Marx described capitalist states, pretending neutrality to maintain order, but serving the interests of the rich. Historian Mark Walgren Summers calls it the era of good stealings, noting how machine politicians used padded expenses, lucrative contracts, outright embezzlements, and illegal bond issues. He concluded, corruption gave the age a distinctive flavor. It marred the planning and development of the cities, infected lobbyist dealings, and disgraced even the cleanest of the reconstructed states. For many reasons, its effect on policy was less overwhelming than once imagined. Corruption influenced a few substantive decisions. It rarely determined one. There were numerous political underminers in effect, especially before the Panic of 1873, which exposed falsifications and created a wave of bankruptcies across the business world in the United States. Former President U.S. Grant was the most famous victim of charlatanry, so to speak. When he trusted Ferdinand Ward, Grant was cheated out of all of his money, most of his pension, and though some friends bought Grant's personal assets and allowed him to keep their use, he was mostly devastated financially by underhanded tactics being used during that time. So some of you may be asking at this point, where does Mark Twain fit into all this? Mark Twain, we remember him as being a humorist, a man who wrote American folklore, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and Whitewashing the Fence and Traveling on Riverboats. Mark Twain was only forced into journalism after his failed excursion into mining. He had had tried his hand at several business ventures, none of which were successful. And only as he got into journalism and began painting the picture of what America, particularly America in the Mid-South and the Midwest, looked like, did we see Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain's views starting to paint the true story of the country. He did get somewhat more radical as he got older. In a letter to a friend, William Howells, in 1887, he acknowledged his views had changed and developed over his lifetime, referring to Carlyle's French Revolution. I was a Girondin, and every time I've read it since, I've read it differently, being influenced and changed little by life and environment. And now I lay the book down once more and recognize I am a sans-culotte. I'm not a pale, characterless sans-culotte, but a Marat. Twain was an ardent anti-imperialist. He viewed any imperial actions by the United States with scorn. He was not in favor of the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. He felt the war with Spain was perhaps the worthiest war ever fought. But by 1899, he'd even reversed course on that. He was not in favor of the Philippine annexation or insurrection. He was not in favor of the American participation in the Pacific at all. And Mark Twain was also, surprisingly enough, he was an ardent supporter of the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of slaves, but not just the emancipation, but he was sympathetic to race relations far before an active civil rights movement was being undertaken. Twain wrote several essays on race relations during the 1870s and 1880s. He was a staunch supporter of women's rights and active campaigner for suffrage. He was also actively supported Helen Keller in her pursuits toward college education and helped her pay her way toward college. Mark Twain was in favor of labor unions. He believed, in one speech to the Knights of Labor, he said, "Who are the oppressors? The few, the king, the capitalist, and a handful of other overseers and superintendents. Who are the oppressed? The many, the nations of the earth, the valuable personages, the workers, they that make the bread that the soft-handed and idle often eat." So here we're seeing a man who we often don't give credit for his activism, taking part in trying to not only change race relations, but trying to improve labor relations as well in a time when many Americans were fighting through the after effects of Reconstruction. As always, if there are any questions, I'm sure there will be a few. Please feel free to pick my brain a little bit. The economic history is definitely a topic where I'm learning as I go. So if you see anywhere where I've made any mistakes, please feel free to point those out as well. As always, have a great weekend, and I look forward to the comments below.